Hello, Patreon backers. Thank you again for supporting us. This is the next extended edition of AskGN. So for this one, we have a few questions. First of all, the mess on the table will be explained in the main episode, but we were busy responding to Jay's tomfoolery, I guess. So first question is Burnout. This is by MustangsbyMatt, who said, do you ever get burned out from the constant work and long hours? What do you do to recharge? The answer is no. And what I do is fill a bucket of ice and tape a bunch of video cards and then beat Jay in scores. That's what I do to recharge. So more work. The difference is we just turn it into, it's fun, but we turn it into videos and work, so something actually still gets done. Other than that, mountain biking, which we have the side channel for, that eventually needs to get some more videos. Next one is thermal paste versus cold. So SerpentXSF had this question, and this is a good one. I'm curious to know, let's see. We know that certain paste or thermal interfaces can crack under sub-zero temperatures. However, with Jayz chiller, would sub-ambient cooling cause issues with thermal compounds? And then he says the thermal interface with LN2 can crack, but what about in sub-zero or using chillers? Does it have an impact? So liquid metal is definitely a problem. You actually don't want to use liquid metal in liquid nitrogen scenarios. So liquid metal is the best thermal conductivity you can possibly get on a CPU, on a die. It's like 70 something watts per meter Kelvin versus maybe 6 or 12. So it's significantly better than everything else. Liquid metal also, because it's a Gallinstan compound that's almost entirely gallium, as the temperature decreases, its efficacy will also decrease. So as you drive temperatures into like negative anything, below 0 Celsius, the liquid metal will lose all of its abilities. It can start to crack and will be worse than just thermal paste. So for liquid nitrogen cooling, the XOC people like Der Bauer, all of them, they'll put a thermal paste on the CPU instead of a liquid metal because it's actually better in that scenario because you don't have any cracking or reduction in thermal conductivity concerns. And then as for Jay's setup, he's using, I think, just an AC unit attached to a cardboard box, which is interesting because taking that approach, you remove a lot of the condensation concerns, where if you're going sub-ambient and you're using any other method, there's a lot of condensation risk. His approach is to just create a small room and then reduce the ambient temperature of that room. So condensation kind of goes away as a problem, which is a very interesting way to do it. He would still have the liquid metal issues if he went to 0-ish or below, but the condensation goes away. Voltage and temperature. So this is the next one from Partial Nobody, who said, I've heard some conflicting data on overclocking. Some articles I've read state that it is not voltage that kills components, it's temperatures. But other places say to never surpass certain voltages, even if your temperatures are in the safe range. Is there truth to both, or is one just wrong? So for this one, there is truth to both. It kind of depends. So voltage is primarily the killer. Voltage creates high temperature scenarios, so they go hand in hand. A good example of a way that they work together to kill parts is if you blast the CPU with, say, 1.5 volts, and you forget to plug your pump in, and then you run it, try to run it at 5 gigahertz or something, definitely you can have some degradation there, particularly with things like if you're working with SoCs or anything to do with the IMC, integrated memory controller, or AMD's SoC, if you start blasting it with voltage like 1.4 volts, even if you keep it really cool, that's a scenario where the voltage is the killer. The voltage will cause degradation of the SoC or of the IMC if you're pushing too high of an SA voltage or too high of an SoC voltage, something like that. Temperature is also a killer, but primarily of things like capacitors. So if you're running, a lot of caps are rated for maybe 5,000 hours at 85C or maybe even 105C if they're better caps. But if you go to, say, 95C instead of 85, you're having the effective lifespan of the caps. And that is a direct thermal impact as opposed to a voltage impact. So it depends on what part you're talking about. They go hand in hand, though, and voltage definitely can kill things like SoC, IMCs. SA can kill stuff on Intel chips, and then temperature can kill stuff as well. Just it depends on what you're talking about. Next one is from rezbrick, who is asking about diagnosing a bottleneck. So the question is monitoring percentage usage of CPU core and GPU sufficient to diagnose bottlenecking between the two? I ask because the cores on my 3930K rarely exceed 80% usage in whatever that game's called, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I think, while my 1080 Ti is often at 100%, yet the game's benchmarking tool indicates that I'm 20% CPU bound. What's going on? It could be, typically, I don't know. I don't know what the game's doing to try and detect utilization and limitations, but typically if you use GPU-Z, it's a pretty good indicator. Like if you're hitting 100% load in GPU-Z on the GPU, then there's a good chance your GPU bottlenecked. And Task Manager is not a great way to look at this, so you should look at something like hardware info instead for core utilization. Task Manager in Windows is often wrong or doesn't know what's going on. So those are really the best ways to just get a quick diagnosis of whether or not you're limited on one component or the other. It's pretty accurate. You could run into scenarios where you're CPU bound but still heavily loaded on the GPU. It might be things like heavy draw calls, or you could be running into a frequency concern where maybe one thread, like you have a render thread that can't keep up, or a physics thread that can't keep up, something like that. But typically, what you're talking about is a good way to diagnose it. So I would just do that for the most part. The next thing, we can switch hardware. So the easiest thing to do is switch components, keep the CPU the same, put a higher end GPU in until it stops improving, and then you hit a bottleneck. But that's not really a good solution for most people because they don't have a stack of parts that they can just do that with. And then the last one for this week's Patrons Ask GN is a firmware question. Zombienerd asked, how hard do you think it would be to modify the firmware on the RTX cards to increase the maximum power target? It has been done, well, yeah, the BIOS has been modified, but it's also pretty easy to just modify the shunt resistors and either put liquid metal on it, which is not necessarily advisable, or you solder another shunt resistor on top of it and piggyback it with like a 3 milliohm resistor or something. But modifying the firmware, I don't know how difficult that is. You could use a hex editor, start digging around for where the power target is. It's kind of easier to find now because you can compare previous BIOS versus the new BIOS with a higher power target, figure out where that line is and change it. But I don't know if the firmware will take if you try to flash it, because we've had issues with that on NVIDIA cards in the past. So probably easiest thing to do is to start with the shunt resistors and then go from there. So that's it for this one. Thank you for watching as always. And thank you for being on our Patreon Discord asking the questions there. I'll see you all next time.